Hi, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here, and it is a great honor and a pleasure to welcome the Wall Street Journal's Yaroslav Trofimov, Le Figaro's Margaux Benn, and Reuters Institute visiting fellow Renée Kaplan for an important event this evening on how the war in Ukraine is reshaping Europe and the world. Where does the conflict stand now? How is it evolving? Why does it matter to the world? These three will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from you here in the audience. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Yaroslav Trofimov is the author of 3 books of narrative nonfiction and 1 novel. He has worked around the world as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal since 1999 and has served as the newspaper's chief foreign affairs correspondent since 2018. Born in Kyiv, Ukraine, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting in 2023 for his work on Ukraine, and in 2022 for his work on Afghanistan, and won the National Press Club Award for Political Analysis in 2024. His latest nonfiction book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, was a finalist for the 2024 Orwell Prize and won the 2024 Peterson Literary Prize. His novel, No Country for Love, or Ce pays qui n'aimait pas l'amour, based on his family's history in 20th century Ukraine, has been published in 5 languages, including French. He holds an MA from New York University. Please join me in welcoming Yaro.
Thank you.
Margaux Benn is a senior reporter with Le Figaro and a documentary filmmaker. She has reported from a dozen countries and lived in Sudan, Kenya, the Central African Republic, Cyprus, and Afghanistan, a country which she has been covering for nearly a decade. Her work in Afghanistan and Ukraine has received several French and international awards, including the Albert Londres Prize and the Bayeux Prize for War Reporters. She is active in various initiatives to promote media literacy and is co-secretary general of France's Feminist Journalists Association, Prenons la Une. Welcome to you, Margaux.
Thanks.
Finally, moderating tonight's conversation is veteran journalist and news leader Renée Kaplan, with experience across public broadcasting, news networks, and legacy newspapers in France, the UK, and the US. She is currently a visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford. Before joining the Institute, Kaplan was the head of news for Arte, and previously the head of digital editorial development at the Financial Times. Welcome, all 3 of you. Get going.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for the welcome. I'm told that it doesn't really matter what I say, but I need to say it close to the microphone. So if at any moment you can't hear me, please wave. We have a lot to talk about because I think we're very privileged to be able to get access to people who have really been on the ground. And that may seem like a cliche, but it's a rare and I think unique thing. But before we go to Ukraine, I think we all probably need to sort of figure out what is the state of play, or what you guys think is the current state of play on the ground right now, and kind of generally the global balance. So I might ask each of you, in terms of the actual latest events, the big one was obviously the most recent incursion of Russia in Polish airspace, followed then by the violation of Romanian airspace. For those of you who then have not been following the minute details, it was very significant, NATO's reaction, ultimately. Where do you guys, and maybe we'll start with you, Yaro, where do you think this sort of leaves the balance on the ground between Russia and Ukraine right now?
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming. I hope I'm holding it high enough. Look, this war, when this war began, this full-scale war began almost 4 years ago, it was meant to be only the first step for Russia, because what happened before the invasion was President Putin coming to meet President Biden at the time and laying out his request for the new security architecture for Europe, which really meant a restoration of a Russian sphere of influence in much of Central and Eastern Europe and perhaps beyond. And conquering Ukraine in 3 days or 3 weeks was meant to be just the first step. That hasn't happened. Russia is still bogged down in its war in Ukraine. It's nowhere near Kyiv. It was defeated around Kyiv in the spring of 2022. And though the Russian military has been on the offensive since Ukrainian counteroffensives petered out in November 2022, in all that time, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers killed and maimed, it was only able to advance by about 1% of Ukraine's territory. So going from occupying 18% to occupying about 19%. But Ukraine is a very strong foe for Russia. The Ukrainian army has about 1 million men and women under arms. It has combat experience in modern warfare that is unrivaled by any other country except Russia. And the size of the Ukrainian military is larger than the militaries of France, Italy, Germany, United Kingdom, and a few others thrown together without the experience. And so I think the calculation in Moscow is that one day they will be able to overrun Ukraine. One day they will be able to take over the whole country, which remains the strategic objective. And after that, everything will be much easier. And that's why they are probing Poland. That's why they're also probing the Romanian airspace with drone incursions there the other day. Because I think the calculation in Moscow is that President Trump will not really go to war against Russia to defend Lithuania or Poland or maybe many other places. Certainly will not risk nuclear war. And by testing NATO, Russia can make NATO collapse as a credible institution. I think that is the next objective. And we have to remember that the modus operandi of Russian imperialism was always to conquer a nation and then use its resources to conquer the next one. We saw it in a small scale in Ukraine, where once Russia occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, then in 2022, every able-bodied man from there was drafted and sent to die fighting his former compatriots. And if Ukraine were to be conquered one day by Russia, I'm pretty sure that millions of Ukrainian men will then be forced to go and fight the next war in Poland, in Germany, as far as Russia is able to get.
Precisely on that last note, Margaux, I want to ask you a little bit more about that. I mean, I think increasingly there's a sense among analysts that Putin has absolutely no intention or desire for any kind of settlement or peace accord. And, these latest violations of airspace had precisely the reaction he wanted, which was to be able to gauge just what NATO would do and what they're capable of and what they're perhaps not capable of. That, this war of attrition against Ukraine is really meant to go on until the next bordering country can be invaded. I mean, what is your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Yaro already covered a lot of this, but it's fairly apparent that, there has been absolutely no diplomatic headway being made, despite what Trump has been saying. There has been absolutely no advances really on the diplomatic front, simply because Putin is not interested in any type of negotiation or productive negotiation. It's quite telling that despite the different meetings that have been going on and the diplomatic dances over the summer, at the end of August, Russia struck in the center of Kyiv, hitting a governmental building. Recently, it hit an EU building, some British offices, and it's actually upping its game in terms of the provocations that it's allowing itself to do with the incursions in Poland and Romania. There have been actually other incursions in Estonia, other incursions in Romania. So this is actually nothing completely brand new. What I'd also like to add is that Russia is actually already pretty much at war with us in a hybrid war. It hasn't sent its tanks to us, but it is waging a hybrid war in terms of information, disinformation, meddling in elections. We'll probably cover this much more extensively later on in the conversation, but it was very eye-opening for me to go reporting in Moldova a few months ago. They had elections there, and I spoke to a a lot of people over there who basically told me in great detail how Russia had meddled with and is still meddling with their elections with extremely sophisticated schemes, and especially a lot of financial power. And it's doing the same here in Western Europe. It did the same, across the ocean. So we know that Russia is already at war with us, and what it's doing in Ukraine right now is that it's hoping to make more headway on the ground in Ukraine with imperialist ambitions elsewhere in Europe. And the Baltic states have understood that very well since the beginning. Poland has understood it very well since the beginning, and that's why they are, at the forefront of efforts to aid Ukraine.
It's a very good point, that to some extent we think that this is the beginning of a testing of an incursion in bordering countries. But of course, with a hybrid warfare, it's been happening for a long time. In fact, just today, some of you may have read the piece about Poland having to defend against up to 50 or 70 cyber attacks against their institutions, including hospitals, every day. So absolutely.
Yeah, it's been the same in Germany. Friedrich Merz openly said it recently, and it's actually quite telling that he openly confessed it a few days ago, but I believe it's been the same in France. It's been the same, So Russia has been waging this hybrid war, and we should act like it actually is and be much more open and aggressive in our response, in my opinion.
Coming back to Ukraine, though, now, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of contrasts on the ground and some of the realities on the ground. And I'm curious about when you guys both really were on the ground for a very long time and a lot at the beginning of the war, in that first year. And what do you think was the dominant story then, that each of you were really telling at the start, or some of the dominant stories, versus how that story has, or maybe hasn't, changed today? Yara, I kind of would like to start with you. You do have a very long view. You were there at the beginning, as was Margaux, and then you were there pretty recently as well. How do you think things have evolved, and how has the mindset evolved, as much as we can talk about a mindset?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think the main fundamental understanding of the nature of the war has not changed. I think Ukrainians view this war as existential. They view it is a war in which surrender is not an option. And yes, I mean, there is a realization now that regaining lost lands like Crimea or Donbass or other occupied territories may not be possible in the immediate future, just because they've tried and couldn't, and that perhaps there is no other way out except freezing the current front lines and freezing the conflict. But the red line remains a surrender that would give Russia the power to control the fate of the 80% of Ukraine that is still free, and that Ukrainians are determined to maintain as independent of Russia. And these two books are very different, cover different historical periods, but they kind of speak to each other, because the nonfiction book talks about in great detail the first year and a half of the war. And I'd really traveled to every nook and cranny of the front lines to just tell the story of what was happening. But the other book, which is a historical novel that tells the story of my grandmother, who survived some of the most harrowing episodes of 20th century history in Ukraine, the artificial famine.
Just so people know, it's basically from the 1920s to the 1950s, right?
The artificial famine in the 1930s that killed more than 4 million Ukrainians, the destruction of the Ukrainian cultural elites that followed suit, the World War II, the insurgency that was then devastating the Ukrainian countryside after that. So all that history is a history that is unknown to people in France, unknown to people in most of the world, but it's really the foundation of the Ukrainian identity, because every Ukrainian family descends from people like my grandmother who managed to survive this tragic period, probably the one of the most, Ukraine was probably the deadliest place in the world in its 2.5 decades. And the spirit of never again is what drives the resistance today, because the losses are tremendous and the cities are destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians lost their lives or lost their limbs or were maimed, and millions of Ukrainians had to flee the country. But I think until now, still, in the rational calculation of most Ukrainians, the cost of resistance is still much lower than the cost of surrender, because the Russians are not hiding their intentions. The very first thing that they do when they occupy a village in Ukraine is to send a bulldozer to destroy a monument to the victims of the famine and say it never happened. And they're building the monuments to the butchers of Ukraine of the past. So the past is not really the past. This past is also the future in the Russian plan.
Yeah.
And I think that hasn't changed, and that is not going to change. And that's why, no matter how much pressure President Trump could put on Ukraine to give up and to give Putin what he wants, the Ukrainians will not do it.
Yeah. That's interesting to see how actually the long view remains a firm view. Margaux, it's striking to me from your reporting in that first year. You were there through I think December of 22, and then further.
February or March 22 until the end of 2023.
Right. So really quite a long and intensive time. And I was so struck by how so much of your reporting talks about stories of improvisation, of people's unsolicited courage, of making do, of just stepping into a void and filling a need, fragmented communications, dispersed pockets of activity. Actually, much of your book has that reporting as well. Was it really that patchwork and ersatz and improvised?
Yes and no. I mean, Ukrainian society had already been, mentally prepared for a war since 2000. I mean, there was a war since 2014. So, for example, even in a more macro sense, there had already been a kind of a pseudo reform of the army, etc. I mean, there was still this. There was already a mentality, maybe not with every young person in Kyiv, but there was already this idea that there is a threat, there is a war in the country, and it could evolve. And so, yes, there was this sense of effervescence and this sense of, at the very beginning of the war, of patriotism, and everyone should rally again behind Zelensky, who, which they weren't before, and everyone was trying to participate in any which way, whether it was by keeping their business open and then giving free free food and whatnot to the soldiers on the front line, whether it was joining the army or volunteer force or whatever. Everyone was trying to participate, and there was this kind of general emulation in a large part of the society, even though, as we know, a lot of people actually left the country as well. So there was that. But what I find very interesting, if we're really comparing and looking at the evolution of all that, is that at the beginning of the war, it was more of a sense of DIY and people, taking out their 3D printers and figuring out what they could do with them, etc. And we were all reporting on these new things kind of cropping up in Kyiv and other places. And today, just to give you an example, because I think he really represents this evolution, I met in, I think, the end of February or beginning of March 2022, a young Ukrainian, man, but boy. He was barely 18. He'd barely turned 18, and he decided that he wanted to be a volunteer. And I met him randomly because I was doing something on very young people who decided to join the volunteer force. And I randomly met him under a bridge and did a report on him. And we stayed in touch. He became a very close friend. And I did several reports, not necessarily on him, but on units that he had been in and stuff like that over the next year and the next. And today, so he evolved quite rapidly, and today he is very much involved in the development of different technologies in the Ukrainian army. He's working with Victory drones. So he had been in a drone unit after a while, and now he's kind of more on the Kyiv side and on the more intellectual and development side. He's coming to Europe to try to lobby for the Ukrainian army and the basically for Ukraine, and he's organizing podcasts, and he's very much involved in the development of AI for defense purposes in Ukraine. And so, this person who had absolutely no prior military experience, who was not interested in defense, he was a music producer, very mature for his age, but he was into music producing, completely became immersed in the war, in the military, and has now become an expert in new technologies and in drone warfare. And he's very, combat experienced. And now he is briefing. He was actually in Paris not too long ago, briefing senior French officers at the military school not far from here, at the École de Guerre. Yeah. And he met several representatives of the Ministry of Defense, the Ministère des Armées here. And so you have a lot of people who kind of started like that, started in the trenches, physically in the trenches, and who are now developing Ukraine's defense industry. And that's very telling for me. I mean, that kind of represents the development also of the Ukrainian army over time.
That's fascinating. And it probably says, from what I'm gathering from both of you, something very deep about Ukrainians per se, and a kind of and the Ukrainian sort of outlook and mindset, to the extent to which that we can talk about one.
Well, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, obviously. But I mean, it's remarkable how far the Ukrainian defense industry has gone in these 3 years. And yeah, it's people like this. One of the characters in this book, his job was to be a Flemish knight tournament reenactment guy. Yeah. And now he's running one of the most successful drone units as well. And, we just, a couple of days ago, Ukrainian drones reached more than 1,000 miles into Russia, bombing refineries, that were never touched during World War II because they were too far for the Germans, who were in Stalingrad.
Yeah.
The technology that Ukraine now possesses in so many domains of drone warfare is miles ahead of what the U.S. military has and the French military has, and all those Western militaries are now trying to learn lessons.
So it is actually impressive the extent to which, and that's the aspect of the story. I think the bigger picture story that we probably have been reading is how much, indeed, despite needing perpetually to plead for weapons, to plead for money, to plead for support, Ukraine nonetheless has indeed been innovating massively, and some of the news that we read is actually quite chilling, the extent to which technology is now doing really quite awful things, arguably. But again, war being probably the mother of creativity, so to speak. Margaux, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, just something that I would really like to stress in this regard is that it's not just Ukraine pleading for more money, etc. A lot of this is two-way. So Ukraine needs money. Ukraine absolutely needs more help, more aid, more weapons. But foreign, Western, European, and American companies have been learning a lot from Ukraine. They have been actually physically going to Ukraine to learn from Ukraine's drone industry. Ukrainians have gone to France, to other countries, to teach, what they have been learning on the front line. And a lot of the time it's a dialogue. And I've been speaking, over the past 3 years, I've been speaking to Ukrainian, but also French and other soldiers who've been telling me that, well, we've actually been, it's been a conversation and we've been learning a lot both ways. So it's not just a matter of, Ukraine begging for money, which it needs.
Sure.
A lot of it is really, we're learning a lot from it too. And we've seen in the past few weeks how unprepared we are in Western Europe for an eventual war against an enemy like Russia or something.
Absolutely, and I don't mean to caricature the notion of pleading. I mean, it was in some ways like, despite needing support and investment, the speed of innovation actually is quite striking, and we see it on these reports all the time of technologies being patented.
It's also because it's a function of how old school is the American and the European defense industry. Because they take their order books that last into the years ahead, and they develop their systems, and then they just without much of a feedback loop. And so a lot of these weapon systems, when they arrive in Ukraine, they work for the first month or two, and then the Russians find a way of diminishing their effectiveness, and then there is no solution because the manufacturer doesn't know what to do. Whereas in Ukraine, you have this constant feedback loop because there are pretty big manufacturers in Ukraine. The Antonov,
Right.
company is one of the world's biggest aircraft manufacturers that is now among many involved in the drone industry. And so they have their people in the field and everybody else. And so if something doesn't work, within a week there is another system. And that constant process of innovation really now only happens in Ukraine and in Russia. And that leaves the rest of the world behind.
It's interesting. I mean, in ways that we aren't used to talking about war, but that you have seen, war has become an active laboratory. And what we were reading as sort of airsats, improvised, people stepping in, volunteering, in some ways is, I suppose, what in Silicon Valley jargon might be agility, and adaptation and pivoting. And which is, I guess, impressive in what, as you point out, Margaux, Ukraine brings to the war or brings to the table. I want to actually go to another territory, although, thank you, to go to another territory. And that is sort of on the ground in Russia, to the extent to which that you guys can speak to that. What are you able to say about the internal situation in Russia, or indeed about what the Russian mindset is, do you think? We see a lot of, we know a lot, or we think we know a lot about the misinformation and the propaganda machines, but it probably is difficult to actually know the extent of it and the extent to which Russians are buying in or not buying in. Does either of you have a view on that?
Oh yeah, I have a lot of views. I think, having lived as a child in the Soviet Union,
and served in the Soviet Army.
Having served in the Soviet Army in the final days of the Soviet Union. Look, back then, you really needed to work hard to find alternative information. There was no internet. The Western radio stations were jammed. The Russians today have Telegram. They can read news. Not everything is blocked, and whatever is blocked is easily circumvented. But I think the consequences for opposing the government now are much harsher than they were in the 80s in the Soviet Union. You had situations where a child draws a picture saying, I want peace, and she's taken away from her parents' custody and the father is sent to jail. And you have these things happening in Russia routinely. And so if you are an average Russian person, you have a choice. You either believe the propaganda and live a quiet life, or you believe that Russia is doing something terrible, and then you have to either oppose the government, which has real consequences, or feel that you are a coward. And so people choose to believe because it's just easier.
Yeah.
And the other big difference with the past is that there was always this ferment of dissidence because the borders used to be closed. But now the Russians who do not like what's going on are free to leave. And millions have left, not to serve in the army and not to take part in the system. And so that gives the regime a lot of breathing room. And even we're not seeing, there was Russia, the Soviet Union as a whole, including Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus, lost about 15,000 people in the war in Afghanistan. Russia now, which has half the population of the Soviet Union, lost hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine. And yet, unlike back then, there is no protests, there is no mothers' movement. Nobody seems to mind that every day thousands are being killed or maimed. Because because of the fear and because of, I think also a lot of people kind of agree with Putin's view that Ukraine is not a separate country. It really is Russia. And that is not a very unique thinking in Russia, not just among the government people, but if you go through even the most freedom-loving voices in Russian culture, Brodsky, Nobel Prize laureate Joseph Brodsky, was then living in America, and he published a poem on Ukraine's independence when Ukraine became independent, saying, I'd like to spit into the river Dnieper, and make it flow backwards because this ungrateful Ukrainians, he used a different word, dare to separate from us. So, and Solzhenitsyn had pretty similar views. So unfortunately, there is also a consensus in Russia behind what is happening.
Yeah. Margaux, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I'm no Russian scholar, and I grew up in Canada, so I have much less legitimacy. But maybe if there's one point maybe that I could add is the tremendous impact that the Russian state has on the education system. And one thing that is very telling is if you look at, for example, the huge enterprise of bringing Ukrainian children to Russia to re-educate them and Russify them. They have actually managed to Russify, at least overtly, children that were already, 10, 12, 13 years old teenagers, people who had lived a fair amount of years in Ukraine and who were taken from their parents, and they have been brainwashed to the extent that they now, I mean, we obviously can't know exactly what's happening in these children's heads, but at least, the Russia disinformation machine and re-education machine is very intent on brainwashing them, and these children will likely or might spend their, the next few years living with Russian families if they can't be saved. And so just imagine if you are born in Russia and go through the Russian education system and your parents are not allowed to think or speak too freely, or else, if they just happen to say the wrong word, or you just happen to draw the wrong drawing, your parent ends up in prison. Just imagine what that does to you and to your brain. So it's easy to be harsh on people when you don't actually live in the country, but I think there's a lot that comes into play in terms of everything that Yaro has mentioned, but also in terms of the power of the state on the Russian population since birth.
Yeah, and actually, if others are interested in that topic you just mentioned about children, the Financial Times just today did a story on a study from Yale. It's a Human Rights Institute at Yale, documenting the fact that there are actually twice more than we thought, of these re-education institutions for children, many of whom have been abducted from Ukraine. So that is absolutely, that kind of education war is probably happening at levels that we weren't necessarily aware of and can't be.
I mean, we shouldn't be surprised. So the Russian state news agency in, I think, April 2022 published an article called "What Shall We Do with Ukraine Once We Win?" And the recipe was very simple. We will physically eliminate the carriers of the virus of Ukrainianness, that is, the intellectual and political elites, and then we will re-educate the children to become Russians. That was a very open blueprint by RIA, state organ of Russia. And so, which explains why the Ukrainians are resisting this fate.
Right.
I mean, the Russian state does not consider Ukrainians to be a separate people.
Right. I'd like to talk now a little bit about covering this story, your experience of actually being a journalist, but also our experience as consumers of news, as readers, watchers, viewers, whatever, of your work and others' work. Aside from the fatigue and the real danger for journalists on the ground, on the front line, there's now also a certain fatigue of the audience. There's blurring over time. We're now 3.5, pushing on 4 years into this war, of events, of what the salient points are. There is a little bit of a sense of repetition of some of the same refrains from the beginning of the war recurring now. At the start, the loudest call was for weapons. 3.5 to 4 years on, the loudest call is still for weapons. Is this something that, and I'll start with you, Margaux, that you think about in your coverage of it, that fatigue?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one illustration of this is that the last time I was actually physically in Ukraine was about 1.5 years ago, I think, something like that, even maybe a bit more. And since then, I've been sent to, other places like Syria, that cropped up in the news, and others. And so I have still been looking at Ukraine, and we do have some independent journalists working for us occasionally occasionally from Ukraine. So we have still been, actively covering Ukraine very much. But a lot of the coverage has now shifted to the diplomatic dances that have been going on, to articles from Washington, articles from from our NATO and defense correspondents. So a lot of the coverage today is about this theoretical, hypothetical piece that different actors are trying to define, which Putin has not even responded to anyway. The coverage is much more about these, hard numbers. How much can we give to Ukraine? What can we do? Ukraine's development of different technologies, of more advanced technologies, the relationships between Ukrainian and European companies, and all that. And so it's become much more, I guess, us-centered, and there's much less appetite, I guess, for frontline reporting. For the first 2 years, I literally almost only reported from the front line, did some stories from Kyiv and other places, but a lot of it, there was a lot of interest in, the lives of the soldiers on the front line and these trenches. That was something very new for us, and today this has shifted, but it's, I guess it's normal as well.
Yeah, well, to that point, actually, Yara, I want to maybe follow up with you on that. How should journalists address the fatigue? I mean, is it okay to no longer cover the front line as much and the daily lives of people, arguably even more people dying than were dying at the beginning of the war?
Well, I think there are two sides to it. Look, we are not covering as much the front line for a simple reason that the front line is not moving much. As I said earlier, Russia gained 1% of Ukraine in almost 3 years of fighting. And so there was a lot of attention to what's happening in the front line in the first months of the war, because there were the Russian invasion and the counteroffensive and another counteroffensive. Unfortunately, there are other competing conflicts around the world, and people's capacity for empathy is limited, sadly. And there are only so many horror stories people can go through in a day. But on the other hand, I think there are ways of covering it, because you just have to find interesting characters who are doing something. I think what we find a lot in journalism is that people don't want to read victim stories. Mm-hmm. And this sort of one of the final lines in this nonfiction book was me sitting in Kyiv on the 1-year anniversary of the war, of the invasion, with President Zelensky addressing people at the commemoration and saying that we have realized one thing in this war. It may be unfair, but it's true. Nobody likes losers, so we have to be winners. And so the way to get people interested in this is obviously to write about people who do something, who have agency. And Ukraine has agency, and it is doing something. So I think the stories that we write, for example, about Ukraine's long-range strikes that are possibly, going to, they already caused a shortage of fuel in Russia, which used to be called, like Central McCain is the gas station with nukes. Now people cannot fuel their cars because Ukraine is taking out so many refineries. And writing about that, and writing about how continuing blows to the rest of the Russian oil and gas industry could actually make it impossible for Russia to pay for the war. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. On that note, actually, of telling stories about good characters who are doing stuff, Margaux, you won the Albert Londres, which is France's highest honor for reporting, for that kind of coverage, I think, in large part. Certainly the jury did flag that, and kind of the uniqueness and power of that coverage at the time. The personal details, the daily life of war. You talk about in one piece, Ukraine, along with the U.S., actually is one of the rare countries in the world that allows for surrogate motherhood for non-residents. And suddenly, though, with the war, the surrogate parents from abroad couldn't come to Ukraine to get their babies. So there was this hospital, a bunker of stray babies. You tell another story of this one combat unit, I think it's called the Seneca unit, who were kids. And these kids, 18 and 20-year-olds, director of music videos and university students who were becoming pilots of essentially kamikaze drones, reinventing themselves overnight, but doing it to a soundtrack with headsets. How did you come to doing that kind of journalism or telling those kinds of stories?
To be perfectly honest, just by listening to people, I have absolutely no merit. But I'd been doing this before in other countries as well, but like when I arrived in Ukraine, everyone is interesting if you listen to them. And so someone who might not seem like the biggest warrior in the world and who might not seem like he has or she a host of experience always has a story. And that's my guiding principle ever since, I started 15 years ago already. And everyone has a story, and especially in Ukraine, and especially since a large part of the population had absolutely no military background, found themselves either in the trenches or piloting drones, or there were a lot of stories like that. But what I really wanted to do was I viscerally wanted to tell the stories of these people, because I guess it became something very, very, very primal, where I felt it was extremely unfair that they were defending their country, but also Europe, and a lot of people didn't really give a damn back home. And so I did this, in different ways. I talked about these 18-year-old kids who were on the front line. I spoke about the life of people in the trenches, but I also gave as many details as I could whenever I saw dead bodies in the street. And instead of saying, oh, it's a dead body, because it quickly becomes a number, there were 30 killed, there were 20 killed, there was an attack. That doesn't mean anything if you're far. But if you describe the hollowed eyes, and you describe the wounds, and you described all the disgusting details, then it becomes real and it becomes shocking. And I just wanted to shock people in a good ways, talking about, people doing stuff, people doing good stuff, but also the displeasing, shocking type of things that basically constitute war. And I think a lot of us had forgotten what that is, because our countries hadn't been so openly involved in wars. Our soldiers had been involved in wars in countries that we don't typically go to, Afghanistan and others. So we didn't have, we didn't feel very concerned directly, unless we knew people who were actually fighting these wars, or had been victims of terrorism or other. But I guess I wanted this to be at last a little bit different with Ukraine.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something.
Quickly, because I want to ask each of you one last question, and I'm conscious of time, and we need to leave some time for questions. So, yes.
Yeah, so I think Margaux and I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan before covering this war. And I think I was trying to apply the same principle in Ukraine as I was in Afghanistan, is to make it not exotic, because I think exoticism is the enemy of empathy. And I was trying to explain that these people who may seem very different to you in Afghanistan, maybe less different, but still, far away in Ukraine, all have the same aspirations, the same desires, the same hopes for life that our readers do. And to show the similarities, in as much as I could in the narrative. And I think that's really important, because all these faraway wars are really not that far.
Yeah. Last question before I open it up to you guys, and taking maybe a step back now and kind of going bigger picture again. You mentioned it, Margaux. This is also, the Ukrainians are also defending not just their country, but they're defending the countries of Europe. And you have a really powerful detail, many powerful details in your book, Yara, where you mention this sign in Krakow. It's a poster in Polish that says, "Ukrainian soldiers are defending your nation." Taking a bit of a step back now and to talk a little bit about Europe and maybe the effect of this war on Europe, only because we are currently in Europe. Obviously, there's an effect on a lot of other parts of the world, the U.S. namely as well, but it is in the European backyard. Europe, to some extent, was slow to realize that this is also a war that Ukraine is fighting for them. Do you think that this war will have a lasting impact on the place of Europe in the world?
Well, yes, it definitely will. I mean, Europe will either exist or not exist after this. It will either be divided between Russia and America and stop being a subject and become an object, or it will find its way of asserting its independence.
Yeah.
It's that. I mean, the war in Ukraine is not about Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's about the future of Europe.
Margaux, similar but different question. Last one. You know a lot of individual Ukrainians. You're still in touch with them. You spent time on the ground. How long do you think Ukraine can resist?
I asked that to a friend today, and because I knew I was coming here, and I actually asked him. I asked a couple of friends actually. How long do you think this can go on? How long can you last? And they both answered actually, well, that basically that will last however long we need to last, because it's our survival, and so it's our survival, but it's also your survival, and what I guess some of the sense is Europe is more and more becoming conscious that this is essentially the continent's, or the EU's, but also the continent's survival that's at stake. And this is why we're kind of lightly, but at least a little bit, upping our game, our diplomatic game. Recently, we are realizing that this is not just about Ukraine. This is not just, as Yaro was saying, a war at the end of the world, where we intervened for X or Y reason. This is a war that everyone should be waging for ourselves. There are a lot of, it has unearthed a lot of divisions, even within the EU. We're realizing that, yes, it's very real that Hungary and Slovakia are countering a lot of propositions. It's becoming very real, the dissensions within NATO. Our dependency on the US has become horribly real. Some countries' dependency on, or initial dependency on Russian oil has also become, this was all stuff that we knew, but that was kind of put under the rug. Yeah. And Europe was kind of sleeping and not realizing that the threat was as imminent as it was. And so we kind of relied on the status quo and relied on pushing back eventual problems. And now it's all blowing up in our face that, depending on Russia or the US is not very smart. And yes, having not upped our defense spending was not very smart. Our armies are not ready to face a war, and not giving more attention to hybrid warfare and to sorry, I've been speaking French all day, and to Russian mission in our elections and in our information space interference. Thank you. In our information space, we should have given more attention to that. It's all blowing up in our face right now, and I think more and more countries are realizing, have been realizing that we're all in this together.
So those are some sobering words from both of you. Let's open it to the floor.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone.
And so because I've deprived you of more time for questions than perhaps you might have liked, if you could keep your questions concise and as questions, please, not comments.
Just following up on the last discussions about Europe and the initial discussions about the goal of having NATO collapse and the hybrid war that's already ongoing, how do you think that the current movements in domestic politics are affecting how Macron, Starmer, and Merz deal with the war and Russia? And if they do not remain in power one way or another, what do you think will be the consequence for Europe?
Easy questions you have. I think I'm going to speak more broadly to this. I think people in Europe, when they look at the danger in the East, have two choices. One is to fight, another one is to make nice to Russia and think that the Russians will treat you kindly as they focus on the others. And we have seen this second scenario play out in Hungary, in Slovakia, probably in the Czech Republic soon. And there is a real danger because the European populations are not ready for a war. I mean, if you ask your average citizen in France or in Italy, are you ready to have your annual leave shorted by a week to help Ukraine? They will say no, probably. So there is a serious risk. But so far, if you look what happened in the last almost 4 years, all the forecasts about the European capitulating because of high gas prices, this and that, and have not come to fruition. It's the Americans who have paid absolutely no economic price for this war that are the most eager to cut the deal.
Next question. In the back.
Thank you. I want to return to what you said at the beginning of this conference, and that is the violation of Polish and Romanian airspace as a means of testing NATO's resolve. But there's another test of NATO's resolve that Putin has not yet deployed that could result in the complete collapse of NATO's resolve: tactical thermonuclear weapons. Why do you think he has not utilized this ultimate weapon to bring about the collapse of NATO's resolve?
Well, I think you have to ask Putin. But honestly, what purpose would a tactical nuclear weapon serve in a war like Ukraine? These were designed to take out large formations of materiel and of troops that we don't see in this war. You don't see giant tank columns streaming through the plains. And I think the overall calculation was that would incur such a horrendous diplomatic cost for Russia, including with China, that would outweigh the benefits.
And I mean, I don't think Putin needs it. I mean, Moscow doesn't really need it. I mean, it has kept putting up, red lines. Europe and the U.S. shouldn't send tanks to Ukraine. They shouldn't send long-range missiles. They shouldn't do this. They shouldn't do that. And it's never used, a nuclear power before, and it hasn't. And it also knows that it can play on the divisions within Europe. It can play on the divisions within NATO. It doesn't need that, and it's still, making way on the ground. It's still, Russia has not conquered a lot of territory in Ukraine, but it has still depleted Ukrainian troops and has done a lot of damage to logistical routes. For now, it doesn't really need to. It's more risk than gains for them right now.
Yeah, I think nuclear blackmail works for Russia already. It doesn't have to use nukes because it can already blackmail with the threats.
In the front.
Thank you. So this is first directed to Margaux. So you mentioned, and it's come up again, the hybrid war, and you said we'd talk about it more, but we haven't really talked about it. So please tell us a little bit more detail. How do they actually, you mentioned all the clever ways in which they're interfering with the elections, but speak to that and more broadly. And is this being reported as much? I mean, it's easy to see footage of tanks and drones, but we don't see footage of the hybrid war. So is this being reported? How can it be reported? So please tell us a little bit more about it and the reporting of it. Thank you.
I'll try to keep this brief. It's a very good question. There's a lot to say, but I'll just keep it very brief. One thing that I should mention is that the reason why it's not as widely reported is also because states don't report these attacks as much. It's been a policy of France and other countries to not systematically accuse Russia or other countries of I've forgotten the word again. yes, of cyber attacks, so as not to escalate, and also because we don't have the means to answer properly to these cyber attacks. Let's be frank, and so that's one thing. The second thing is that we have been a little bit slow to react as well. But there has been reporting on it, and for example, when I was in Moldova earlier, it was extremely interesting to delve into all the different ways in which. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I'll tell you. It's not very fresh in my mind, but basically, just one element of it is that Russia has this kind of proxy that's an oligarch, a Moldovan oligarch that's extremely close to the FSB, that's basically being piloted by the FSB, and that's running kind of like a Ponzi scheme, kind of like these Herbalife schemes, whereby this is just one element of it, it's very complex, but there's money given to different groups and different leaders of towns, cities, and neighborhoods, and then in turn, these people try to recruit other people to spread disinformation, to do minor disinformation attacks like write stuff on walls, etc., etc. There's also vote buying, a lot of vote buying, and so people in certain areas of Moldova, especially remote, are given special cards where they can withdraw money from Russia, rubles, and in return they must vote for the correct person, etc. I mean, there are lots of ways. There's also misinformation on different social media, all the different social media, deep fake videos of Moldovan politicians, including Maia Sandu, that appear to be saying outrageous things, and in fact that video was never filmed. It's a fake video. It's a deep fake video. And this works because a lot of the population in the countryside is more elderly, is less educated in all these things. And so all these videos, even if they're not always extremely well made, it works. And so there has been a host of different ways in which Russia has been meddling in the Moldovan elections, but it has also meddled in other elections of many other countries. And so, but we could go on and on and on about how Russia meddled or tried to meddle in Western European countries' elections, U.S. elections, etc.
I think the Moldova example, I'll just add one thing and then go to the next question, that is particularly interesting for its mixture of actual on-the-ground vote buying with the more hybrid or the more sort of virtual kind of misinformation and fake news and deep fakes. And I mean, that really is the perfect example of hybrid.
And it's actually been so prevalent in Moldova that it was very interesting to listen to different leaders and different members of the government speak about the back and forth they had with different Western European countries, because we're also trying to learn from them. They're trying to learn from us, and we're trying to learn from them how to counter these disinformation campaigns and these cyber attacks, etc. So again, it's a two-way thing where we're all basically realizing that we're not up to date on all this, and we need to move fast. So they've created different institutions. They've been liaising with France, Germany, different countries to try to exchange ideas, technologies, processes, organization. Yeah.
Maybe back there, and then in the front. Please.
Russian propaganda says that the people from Donbass feel Russian and don't feel Ukrainian. Is it a total lie, a part truth, and what conclusion should we make out of it?
So there were 6 million people who were living in the parts of Donetsk and Lugansk that were occupied by Russia in 2014. About 2/3 of them left by 2022. They voted with their feet. They went to the rest of Ukraine, they went to Europe, they went to Russia itself, because they didn't want to live in the kind of system that Russia created there. Out of the 2 million who stayed, most men were mobilized and sent to die or be injured in the war against the rest of Ukraine in the last 3 years. So if you go around Ukraine, you feel a lot of refugees from Donbass who do speak Russian at home, but definitely don't want to live under Russia. And I think very few people. There was the biggest conceptual error that people outside of Ukraine had, that, well, if you speak Russian, then you must be Russian. This whole category, les russophones, which is completely meaningless in Ukraine, because national identity, citizen identity, has nothing to do with the language. You know, President Zelensky grew up speaking Russian. I mean, I grew up speaking Russian in Kyiv. Most people in Kyiv grew up speaking Russian. And the head of the armed forces of Ukraine was born in Russia and came to Ukraine as an adult man, and he's still fighting Russia. So Ukrainian nationalism is a political concept, not something based on blood, religion, language, and which is why Putin's war failed, because he was really counting on vast parts of Ukraine switching sides just because they happen to speak Russian at home.
And the last question, before we have to take back the mic.
So, in your view, what would be the most effective practical response of Europe today to help Ukraine? Would it be, for example, revoking all the visas of Russian students, or, for example, revoking visas to tourists, some kind of, or something else? Because obviously security guarantees will never happen. Nobody, exactly because of what you're saying, that nobody is willing to fight the war with Russia.
So nobody is willing to fight the war for Russia, with Russia, but Ukraine is. And if you look at the drones that flew into Romania and Poland, well, it's very hard to shoot them all down, especially if there are hundreds of them. But it is not that hard, if you have the right weapons, to destroy the factories that make them. And Ukraine has been trying to do that, but right now, even though it's developing its ballistic missile program, it's still not operational. And the drones can only do so much. Ukraine has already implemented unilateral sanctions on the Russian oil exports, achieving a lot. So I think at the end of the day, Russia will only stop this war if it cannot pay for it, i.e. it cannot export its oil and gas, and if it cannot manufacture weapons.